you have been asked by a few Oxford Dons to stand for the election of a professor of poetry. How that comes about?
I think it was mostly because there's always been a tradition that the professor of poetry at Oxford should be a poet himself or herself, a person who writes poetry, who may not be very academically disposed towards it or be a great critic of poetry, but basically a practitioner. Now it so happens, of course, that in general speaking, since the period of about 1955 or something, almost all of the poets who have been professors of poetry who were poets, which means the majority of them, have also been quite distinguished critics. I mean, even I have done quite a lot of critical writing of a more journalistic sort, in that I reviewed poetry for 20 years in the Observer as their main poetry reviewer. I mean, I've written lots of articles and published some, but I am not, of course, an academic critic of poetry. I am a writer of poetry, and I've been writing it for over 50 years, which makes me rather elderly to become a professor. But I feel, in a way, that the whole tradition of the professorship going to a poet is a very good tradition, and at the present moment the only other person who's been nominated for the task is not a writer of poetry. He's a very, very erudite and distinguished critic of poetry, Professor Christopher Ricks, but he is not a practitioner of it. And this is somewhat to break the tradition in Oxford, which has always emphasised, or when I say always emphasised, since about the time of the Second World War, has emphasised that the poetry professorship should go to a poet rather than to an academic critic.
And do you think, I mean, so your contest for the professorship, because as far as I know, the previous two elected unopposed, and this one is perhaps likely the same is likely to happen again.
If I hadn't agreed to stand, it may be my standing or agreeing to stand will liberate other persons, and people will come, other candidates will come forward.
And make it more kind of a democratic, give a democratic touch.
Well, I mean, I think it's a curious kind of job, of course, because it's not in an ordinary sense it's not like you wouldn't elect a professor in any chair normally amongst graduates from the university. It would have to be done on a selection basis of how well qualified the candidates were. But this is different. This is not an academic chair. This is a chair which stands for poetry, which tries to interest people in poetry, and which in the past, especially when assumed by Auden, and to some degree I think by the other professors of poetry that took the job, to encourage poetry writing amongst the undergraduates. In other words, it is not an academic post in the sense that you don't mark papers, you don't really do seminars, you give lectures and you talk and you appear, as it were, to stand up for, you personify or embody the art of poetry rather than teach it in an academic sense.
Do you think it's a kind of a post, as you said, I mean, so it's a kind of a chair of the Babel, I mean, so the title of one of your collection of poetry?
Well, I wouldn't think so really, because Babel was a very disastrous circumstance where nobody could talk to anybody because they all spoke different languages. I think all conferences, literary conferences, tend to be rather Babel-like in that people get chattering to each other and don't always take in very much of what each is saying. I think that this is a different case. This would be this is in fact, because I've heard lectures given by Oxford professors of poetry. It depends very much, I think, upon how you see poetry. Whether you see poetry as part of a firm academic basis in literature, or whether you see it as one of the areas of creative entertainment. For me, poetry is essentially something to be read and to be written. I'm not interested in its promulgation via critical insights. I think everybody who reads poetry has his or her own critical aspect of it, critical take on it.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as a kind of critical orthodoxy which is maintained by an academic establishment. And I think it's good to bring some sort of recognition that poetry is actually written by people outside of universities, to bring that back into universities, so the university people don't think that because they are the custodians of poetry, they are necessarily equipped to understand it better than people who are not custodians of it, but who simply are involved in it. I mean, you can be quite cynical about this. I mean, Philip Larkin, the great English poet, remarked once that he thought the poet at the university, he meant by that not the poet who was teaching in an academic post, but the poet who was somehow involved in talking to undergraduates and such, was about as welcome as a cow that turned up at the headquarters of United Dairies. In other words, the university's job is to bottle the milk, the cow's job is to produce it.
But on the other hand, I don't remember how many collections of your poem wearing the jacket of Oxford University Press, and your name has been an entrant to the Oxford Reference Dictionary.
Yes,
and you got a permanent home in the heart of English language.
But that's true in one sense, but untrue in another, because Oxford University Press, although an organ of the university, was run separately from the university, except that the university had the final control over it. And for 28 years, between 1970 and 1998, all my poetry was published by OUP, or nearly all of it. I did publish some other books.
And the last your collected works amounting to 800 pages.
That's right. That came from OUP. But suddenly, the University Press decided in 1998 to stop publishing contemporary poetry.
And also
and
books.
So ever since then, I've ceased to be an Oxford poet in that sense. But for 28 years, I was published by Oxford University Press, and I consider myself, therefore, to be a kind of ex officio alumnus of the university. Though, of course, I never went to the university as an undergraduate, nor have I any degree from the university. But I am connected with the university in this sense, that the greater part of my publishing life, I was published by the university's own press. So I'm not entirely...
And also books about your life and about your work, also published by OUP.
Oh yeah, but only in Australia, OUP, that was. It wasn't British OUP. OUP, spread all around the world. But I feel the point about it is that the people that are nominating me, some of them have university positions, but they're predominantly writers of poetry rather than expounders of it. And so to that extent, my candidacy represents something, a different emphasis from that of Professor Ricks. I mean, I'd be the first person to acknowledge what a brilliant critic Professor Ricks is. And also I remember that during the period of the 1970s, 1980s, he was also a very good popular journalist. He wrote regular reviews in magazines like The Listener. So it's not that he lacks the common touch, but that he does have, of course, a high university profile as a critic, which of course I don't have. And that my emphasis in this candidacy is to try to bring the emphasis on what poetry is about back to the writers of it and the readers of it, and not the critics. I would also, at the same time, of course, always have to stress, as Auden and various other people have pointed out, that we owe it to scholars to get good texts. If there were not good scholars, a lot of the poets of the past would have vanished, and we wouldn't be able to secure right text from them. I mean, a good example would be, I can think of two poets, particularly Christopher Smart and the Earl of Rochester, both of whom owe their present standing to the assiduous labours of scholars who managed to assemble their works from what were basically sort of disjecta membra. And so we certainly owe scholarship a tribute for putting the text together, getting the best text, making certain that they're available, printing them properly. But there is another emphasis which is particularly interesting for undergraduates, I think, in that a practicing poet is producing the material which the next group of scholars, the next range of scholars, is going to use.
In the independent newspaper, they said they are going to elect a professor of poetry in the footsteps of W. H. Auden. And Edward Mendelssohn, in his email to me, he held your poetry in high esteem, and he said your poetry is very Audenesque.
I'm afraid perhaps it's a bit too Audenesque. I mean, a lot of people think that it's been influenced greatly by Auden. I mean, my admiration for Auden is tremendous.
And also one of the people who nominate you is a great Auden scholar, John Fuller.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is, you could say that there is a kind of school of Auden, and I certainly would be proud and happy to belong to it. But I think, on the other hand, that one doesn't necessarily write particularly like the people one admires. I mean, the influence of Auden could be seen in my work, but I'm a very different person to Auden, and I don't have anything like his range and his quite remarkable sort of psychological insights and his sheer scholarship and knowledge. But I mean, I share with him the idea of what poetry should be, I think. I know that when he was very effective...
But recently some critics, they said, forget about Auden, Porter is the real thing. They suggest that you have already overtaken Auden in many aspects.
No, it's certainly not true. But it could be that I've got something of the same kind of approach to poetry as Auden. I certainly wouldn't feel myself in any way in competition with him. I think my vision of my going in for this is that all my life I've tended to be a non-official sort of person, and if I get this, it'll be still non-official, but it'll be quite interesting to find myself, if I'm there, propounding the idea that poetry is in fact written by people who also read it, but not necessarily by people who examine it and criticize it or categorize it, as indeed scholars do. I quite like working in universities. A lot of people, especially during the 60s, I used to have a lot of friends who felt it was their job when they went to a university, if they were practical contemporary writers, to take the undergraduate side against the staff, and sort of say, and be hostile to academic study. I'm not at all hostile to academic study. I like working in universities, but I don't like working in universities on formal curricula. I prefer to do it. I prefer to be someone who just talks to university students and looks at their works and helps them if possible, or makes some kind of discrimination about it. In other words, to be available as somebody who could be asked and consulted. And I wouldn't in that way in any sense get in the way of the proper academic study of poetry, which is after all, Oxford's got a very elaborate English faculty to look after the discussion and formal treatment of poetry.
But the collection of your essays, Saving the Wreck, published by the Chen, including that collection also included your British Academy lecture. It seems to me it has demonstrated your poetic and intellectual caliber, perhaps more than a professor.
But this is not something which could stand up against the vast array of academic papers and things which are published all around the world in every university. I mean, if you mentioned Auden, I mean, in that sense, Auden was a very great critic, in a way that I am not. But the kind of criticism I write is not unlike the kind of criticism Auden wrote. That is to say, it's journalistic. It's not formal literary criticism. And I think, I mean, I don't think that the best critics have always been scholarly anyway. I have an enormous regard for William Empson. Now, he was great. He was a great scholar, but he was also a highly eccentric person in terms of what he liked and didn't like. And all I want poetry to do is to be intelligent and to be have feeling. And I think that the great fights that have been going on between the avant-garde and the arrière-garde, between pastoral and city, between I don't know, between what apparently needs to be done historically now and what was done historically in the past, all of these things are all subject to discussion, but in the end what we really need more of is people actually looking at the text, reading the poems, and reading more poems, and reading for their own pleasure and also for their own illumination. And my job, if I should ever find myself as Professor of Poetry at Oxford, would be to draw as strong a line of communication as I possibly could to people that actually wanted to write poetry or wanted to read it, and not just for getting further degrees and promotions and PhDs and the like.
If you find yourself in the chair of a professor of Oxford Professor of Poetry, do you still feel that you are an outsider? But as a poet, you are perhaps a more kind of insider
Nice
anybody else, and your poetry has already left a mark in the English language, if you like.
It has a bit, but I mean, on the other hand, there are a lot of other poets who are far better known publicly than I am. I mean, a good example, there are thousands of them, but you know, Seamus Heaney is a Nobel Prize winner and a world. He was Professor of Poetry up there. I mean, yes, I am. I'm a publicly known poet, and not necessarily a very famous one, but being outside or inside has never really worried me, because in some ways it's easy to describe me as an outsider because I was born and brought up in a fairly remote part of Australia. Well, not wasn't that remote, but I mean I wasn't even in Sydney or Melbourne. I was coming from Brisbane, and I didn't come from a literary family. In fact, I don't think my mother and father read anything very much at all. But I wasn't in that sense an outsider. I was educated fairly well, and when I came to England, I knew immediately everybody would see me as an Australian, but I've been here so long that I certainly don't feel anywhere an outsider, but then I don't see myself as an insider either, because
I mean, so as a poet,
yeah,
your relationship with the English language.
That's an inside relationship. I mean, it must be. All writers have an inside relationship with the language. I mean, and I do think it's very important to distinguish between the insight into a language which a writer has as distinct from a person who spends his time just criticising the language. Of course, this is a bit confusing because an awful lot of critics are also the writers of various kinds themselves. I mean, there is the great thing I think that universities do is to keep the past alive, and I'm sure that the faculty at Oxford can do that without my help. But I think it's also important and valuable to recognise that the best bridge from the past to the present is in the writing of the people who respect the past but work in the present.
So
that might be enough. You can drop that.
Yeah, this is very good. Yeah, we can. Have you got anything? I mean,
I don't think it's very much more.
I wonder your beautiful humility could play down your importance in the world of poetry. And for me, for instance, I benefit equally from reading Auden, W.H. Auden's Knowing and Judging, and also your collection of essays.
Yes, I think I don't think I'm humble. I don't think it's a question of humility. What I think it is a recognition of other people's attainments and achievements, and also a recognition that there are, there's a famous biblical sentence which says, "In my Father's house are many mansions," and that, I think, is the truth of the case. The truth of the case is that literature is a huge domain. It's a vast land of activity. I'm also very interested in other arts, particularly in music and also in painting and sculpture, though largely in painting. In the iconography of painting and how things look and what they mean, in symbolism, in fact. But I think it's all interwoven, and for me, poetry is always about the kind of processes of life which we all go through. That's to say, I'm not a pure poet. I don't sort of feel that the only real interest in poetry is language itself. I'm not a sort of a malame. It'd be nice if I were, because there's a kind of purity about that. And I'm just not interested in poetry only for its sound. But it's an enormously complex matter what constitutes a fine poet or a fine poem. And I think that the longer you live, the more you become uncertain in your own mind as to what truly constitutes poetry. And I think one of the jobs, if I were to get this job, one of the tasks, I should say, I would face if I were to become Professor of Poetry at Oxford, would be to try to point out to people the sheer complication, the sheer width of experience involved in the art of poetry, and to avoid falling into a historical pattern whereby you just think that some things inevitably led to other things and so on and so on, as though there's a kind of huge onward march of historical inevitability. I would like to stand up for all kinds of different poems, and I would like to persuade undergraduates, particularly, because that's what I suppose universities are for, to persuade undergraduates to read as widely as possible. And I want to get away from what I think is the very diminishing concept, which is much encouraged, I think, sometimes by schoolmasters, sometimes by journalists, and sometimes by academics, that you can just dismiss majority of the writing in the world and just say, well, you only really need to know this person, that person. In other words, setting up a kind of constricting canon which says these are the only poets to care about. I would regard my job as to try to point out to people that there are a hell of a lot of poets that you ought to be interested in, or you could be interested in, and not to keep narrowing the canon and keep narrowing what ought to be said about anybody in order to produce a kind of fairly ruthless orthodoxy.
Once you said, when you were interviewed by a journalist, you said, my home is my imagination. Do you still hold?
Well, I feel quite at home in London, as a matter of fact. But if I'm in Melbourne or Sydney, I feel quite at home. There are cities I don't feel at home in. I've never felt at home in New York.
Okay, is this what you mean by being the air plant?
I've seen myself as an air plant. I mean, I've got an Australian accent. I've got all my early experiences were in Australia, and therefore, of course, naturally, so much of what I refer to automatically springs from my early life in Australia. But then I've spent more than 50 years in England, and England is still, curiously enough, a kind of home of the English language. I mean, the English language is at home all over the place, but England is something of an ancient home of the English language. I have never worried about the sense of being rooted in one place or another, roots. In that sense, I'm an air plant, yes. I don't... I feel... I often think, it sounds ridiculous, but I often think that, except that, of course, I'd be bewildered by being scared stiff, but if I were on my way to the execution in the guillotine or something, I'd still be interested in things that were going on around about me, because I'd have thought that the things that are fascinating in life go on being so, and you don't, if you're wise, restrict your concerns to some particular canon. And there's a lot of bewilderment amongst modern readers about what poetry is about, and I would certainly think that, despite my great interest in particular poets of the past, some especially poets like, I suppose, Browning and back to Shakespeare, I would think one of my chief jobs up at Oxford would be to try to help people make up their mind what they thought about contemporary poetry.
Do you think either a kind of ownership of imagination?
No, not really. I think well, the language is owned by anybody who can use it well, is my view. I don't think it applies to one country, to any other country. I don't think it applies to one class, or to educated people and uneducated people. A lot depends, it seems to me, on how eloquent, on how satisfying to you the eloquence of language is. And so nobody can own. Fortunately, language is a tribal thing. Nobody can own it. It's owned by everybody. It doesn't have any prescriptive provenance. It's something which anyone can use, but it's behoving on us to use it as well as we possibly can.
So do you think, as a practitioner of poetry, do you think you could still be yourself if you elected as a professor of poetry without falling into a trap of serving other people's expectation?
No, I don't. That wouldn't be too much of a concern, because it's not a full-time academic job. I mean, you're only there part of the time, and when you are, one of your main duties will be strictly person-to-person communication. You'd probably talk to individual students, and you give lectures, which would be public statements, but it might be hard work, actually, but certainly I don't think that there'd be any danger of it squashing my own efforts. I mean, I tend to produce about the same amount of poetry each year. I tend to write about 40 original in the sense of individual poems each year. Only a small proportion of them are good enough really to print, but I mean, or good enough to print in books anyway. So I don't think that would come into play. I mean, sometimes one writes with much greater facility than others. You can go through a bad patch when you don't feel like writing anything. Auden used to say that he felt sick if he didn't write a poem after, over some number of weeks. I think that's true, if it's a little exaggerated. I wouldn't be frightened of suddenly finding myself forced to dry up or something because I was in a slightly different, rarefied atmosphere.
Yeah.
I don't think that Oxford's such a rarefied place anyway. It's,
Peter, this is the email sent to me from the editor of this website called Candida Clark, a novelist, very young novelist. And would you like to have a look at her email and see if you any question you would like to answer?
One opportunity Oxford would offer to me if I was up there in this professorship would be to point out how poetry now ranges across so many different sorts of society. Of course, I am only even a marginal authority on English poetry in English language. When you consider there are so many people writing in English at the moment, such a wide distribution, and so many apparent chances for people to be at variance with each other. Like one of the curses of poetry has been, I suppose, that it's very factional. People who like one man don't like another man, etc. And there are schools of poets, there are predominances of style. Style wars are one of the things which you find in contemporary poetry. I would like to try to introduce the art concept of poetry as individual pantheons. Each person makes up his or her own mind about who the poets are, who are good, and I'd like it to range across the different styles. I wouldn't want to be a partisan to one kind of writing as distinct from another kind of writing. Whatever my own personal preference as to what writing should be, I've always been, in my relations with public, particularly if I was doing writer in residence jobs, trying, when somebody showed me work, trying to see how that work could be best made excellent in itself, and not try to convert the person who was writing that way into some way of writing which I thought would be better. In other words, any kind of tutor in poetry, or any kind of tutor in any art for that matter, is there to realise the full potential of the style and the quality and the understanding of the artist, and not to superimpose his or her own preferences. Of course, naturally, you hope you'll encounter work written by undergraduate poets which you're able to support completely because it seems good. But you wouldn't really want to start a crusade. You wouldn't want to say, well, writing that way is bad, you must only write this way, or for that matter, use your influence in some kind of combative way to fight corners, to fight individual ways of writing. We know all too well, without going into cases, that there are many embattled kind of styles in the world today which hate each other, which have no affection for each other, which who believe they alone possess the truth of the matter. It's almost as bad as, politics and religion in that sense. There is so much bigotry, so much hostility, so much warfare. And of course nobody can be free of bias. But there is a lot of common ground as well. And that common ground really is centred in one thing: is it well done or is it not well done? And I think over the years you build up an ability to distinguish what's well done from what's not well done, even in styles which are not partly yours. And you develop a skill at being able to judge how effective something is, even if it's being effective in a department which is not a department necessarily attractive to you. And I think that quality I have developed over the years, mainly by talking to other people, and more or less to contemporary writers really, rather more than undergraduates. And I think that it can be very lonely being a writer, and if you have someone to talk to, you don't have to follow it. I remember, for instance, when I belonged to what was called the group, which a group of young poets, we were all quite young, I found it quite helpful to talk to them. I don't think I've necessarily changed what I was doing when they found what I was doing difficult to follow or not attractive, but it helped me to focus on how much I myself knew what I was doing by learning how other people saw it. And I think that can be a possible thing which could be offered to undergraduates.